stand over here in my usual spot. Well, good morning, and welcome to Sacramento's historic Old City Cemetery. My name's Mattie, this is Eric, and over there in the black dress is Julianna. And today we're going to tell you terrible tales of love gone wrong. Before we get started, I just want to ask, I always ask, how many of you have never been to the cemetery before? A few of you. Well, welcome. We're glad you're here. I'll give you a very brief background on the cemetery. It was started in 1849-1850 when John Sutter Jr., the founder of our city, donated 10 acres of land as burial ground. And this 10 acres of land was far to the south of the city. The city of Sacramento ended at R Street. There was a levee at R Street with railroad tracks on top of it. That was the end of the city. So you had to leave the city and come all the way down here to get to the burial ground. Like I said, it was 10 acres, then it grew and grew and grew to about 30 acres, 60 acres, 90 acres, and then it started contracting. The city sold the southern ends of it to the Masonics and to the Oddfellows for their cemeteries. And then when Broadway was enlarged, it was brought in this way. And so, of course, people were found out there and reburied in here, but we know we didn't find all of them. So as you're driving down Broadway, just think about who you're driving over. I'm going to turn it over to Eric, but before I do, I just want to make a few comments. We have a donation box right there next to Megan. I'm going to point that out. Everything we do is volunteer work. We do these things to raise money for the repair, restoration, and maintenance of this beautiful historic cemetery, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. So if you enjoy the tour today, if you like what you see, if you want this cemetery to be maintained the way it is, to be even better, we'd love donations. If you want to know about upcoming tours and events, Jean is holding up the clipboard. Feel free to give her your email address and you can get notifications of upcoming tours. We also have a website, oldcitycemetery.com, and we have a Facebook page, Sacramento Historic Cemetery. So look us up online, get on the email list, and you'll know about upcoming tours. So, with that, turning it over to Eric, today's tour leader.
Thank you, Mattie. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to Love is a Many Splintered Thing. Just before we get going, I just want to point out a couple things. This is at least, I've been a volunteer here for a couple of years. I've assisted with other tours. I've done research for other tour guides, but this, at least officially, is my first tour. So, be nice to me. I have this set here, right? Yeah. There. Okay, I don't want to sell like that. Anyway, but I do want to point out and thank profusely the lovely and talented Julianna and the lovely and talented Mattie, who will be assisting me telling some stories of their own. And also, I do want to point out, thank you, Mattie, for pointing out the tier grounds, because as we go through the cemetery, there are a few burials that I'll be talking about. We'll be talking about them in the cemetery, but they're actually somewhere under Broadway. So when I mention the tier grounds, someone buried in the tier grounds, it means they're somewhere under Broadway. But yes, getting back to the title, Love is a Many Splintered Thing. Now, when you first read that, you might have thought to yourself, isn't that supposed to be Love is a Many Splintered Thing? Isn't that the Four Aces, November 1955 #1 Billboard hit? Wasn't it, didn't it win the best original music, best original song for the movie of the same name that was released afterwards? Isn't it supposed to be Love is a Many Splintered Thing? And you'd be right. That's where I did get the title from. And love, yes, can be a many splintered thing. Love in its pure and wholesome, all adulterated state is a many splintered thing, a beautiful thing. It can lead to terrific tales of love and devotion for one person for another, even despite the veil of death that may have come between them. And we'll hear some stories about those. We'll get those out of the way first, because I know you want to hear all the stabbings and murders and suicides. But we'll do some sweet stories first as well. But also, love can be a many splintered thing. Love, corrupted, by just fear and anger, hatred, jealousy can be a many splintered thing. Can lead to those passions. Most of the time, most people can keep those passions under control, but when love ends, or was never love to begin with, perhaps it was just lust disguised as love, those passions, hate and jealousy and anger can boil up to the surface and sometimes have very lethal consequences. And we'll hear some of those stories as well. But before we do that, like I said, I want to start off with some of the sweeter stories of love here in the cemetery. So actually, Julianna, you could lead us down to General George and Margaret Wright. We'll hear the first of those stories. You might say it was a love that was as deep as the ocean.
All right, if you take a look behind me, there's a white marble obelisk, quite large. That's General George Wright. George Wright was born in Vermont. In 1822, he graduated from West Point. He married Margaret Wallace Foster, and he had a very distinguished military career. Now, if you want to know more about his military career, I would suggest you come to the November 7th tour that we're doing called Freedom Calling. And if you want to know about more tours, grab one of these guys when we're finished at the kiosk. Okay, so he had a very distinguished military career. He became a brigadier general. And of course, when you have a distinguished military career, you move quite a bit, quite often. So they ended up, he and his wife, here on the West Coast. During the Civil War in 1865, or during the Civil War, General Wright was in charge of keeping the West safe. He and an army of ragtag volunteers. So they were supposed to keep the West and, of course, our wealth safe during the Civil War. He did a good job. In 1864, he was given a new assignment, and he was able to spend more time here in Sacramento. Then about less than a year later, he was once again reassigned. He was given the post as commander of the Department of Columbia at Fort Vancouver. So that would require yet another move. So July 28th, 1865, General George Wright and his wife Margaret and their horses, and presumably their baggage, all boarded the Brother Jonathan. The Brother Jonathan was a steamship out of San Francisco, so it was headed toward Portland. They boarded the ship, and the crew believed that they might hit bad weather. Unfortunately, they were correct. They hit bad weather even before they made it to the first port, which was Crescent City. They got to that first port, and then on July 30th, at 9:30, the whistle blew for the Brother Jonathan, and it was off to its next leg of the journey. Unfortunately, they hit bad weather. It was a blue nor'wester. There were high seas and horrific winds under clear blue skies. So the captain decided he'd better turn the vessel around and head back to Crescent City to wait out the storm. So he turned it around, and he was trying to avoid all known reefs, at which point, at 1 o'clock, 3.5 hours after the vessel had left Crescent City, a mountainous wave picked up the Brother Jonathan, crashed it down on a mysterious rock. That was the end of the Brother Jonathan. Now, the Brother Jonathan was carrying about 300 passengers, as well as about $40 million in currency and gold coin in today's money. Of those 300 passengers, there were 15 survivors, 14 men and 1 woman. Unfortunately, George Wright and his wife were not among those 15. They were last seen on the deck of the Brother Jonathan, embracing one another. So unlike Rose in the Titanic, they did hold on. Just saying. So on their headstone is imprinted, "Lovely and pleasant in life, and they were not, and in death they were not divided." General George Wright and his wife Margaret. Okay, so if you take a look at our most distinctive monument back there, the one made of tile, sometimes it's unceremoniously called the barbecue by me.
See your point.
That's really nice. Yes, it does look a bit like a barbecue. That's the monument for Georgia Fisher. Georgia Fisher was born in New Orleans, and her family moved quite a bit before they finally settled in Freeport, where her stepfather became the town's blacksmith. So the tile that you see here, the tile base, was done by Martin Bergman. He was a Swiss immigrant. He and his brother came here for clay, not gold. They saw an exhibit in Stockholm with a sample of California clay, and they realized there were some commercial possibilities here. So they decided to come here, and they bought an interest in the Sacramento Pottery Company. They did so well with that they eventually bought the company and renamed it Bergman Brothers. They were so successful with that they were able to bring their family over from Europe, their mother, father, 2 brothers, and a sister. And they all lived, and their shop was on 30th and N, where the Ebby's restaurant used to be. It's now an IHOP. lovely part of our history.
Yeah.
IHOP now.
Exactly.
So they lived there, and with such a large household, they needed a little bit of help, so they had to hire a domestic servant to help them out. Well, Martin did the base. Aside from the base, there was quite a bit there. Now, it doesn't look like much now because it's been vandalized, there's been theft, the ravages of time. But on the top part, at one point, there was an angel, Gabriel. That was made by Martin's father, John. Next to that, sort of on the smaller part, there was a beautiful ornate pillar that was made by Martin's brother, also John. And together, the three of them made a fence that went around it. So after the tour, if you'd like to, there's a plaque, and it shows you what it looked like. It's kind of a small picture, black and white. There's also a picture of Martin Bergman and a picture of Georgia Fisher. So some of the descendants of Martin Bergman said that when he was making this base, there were tears streaming down his face. He and Georgia Fisher were not strangers. When his mother had to hire a domestic, she hired Georgia Fisher at the age of 17. Now, that particular year, that when Georgia Fisher passed away, it was 1875. It was during the holiday season. She died on December 27th. It was a very busy holiday season, very festive, and she took ill with typhoid pneumonia and died suddenly. Now, it was a particularly busy season because she was busy working on her wedding. Her wedding was planned for January 1st. Her wedding to Martin Bergman. So this is a testimony to the love and the grief felt by a fiancé over the death of his love mere days before their wedding.
Did you tell us how old she was when she passed?
19.
Oh, wow.
Typhoid pneumonia. So that's Georgia Fisher.
Now, as you might imagine, most of the stories you'll hear today are about murders and suicides, and they have a tendency to get a lot of press, a lot of ink spilled in the newspapers. Those are easy to do. Lots of places to search for information. There are others, however, when it's just dying of old age or just dying peacefully, doesn't get as much ink. So the next few stories I'm going to tell you, just to set up the mood with more sweet stories. Not that much information, but I have the real core, the important parts. This next residents, George and Mary Francis. Now they're actually buried, let's see, far off that way, so we won't bother visiting them, but they're far off that way. Now George died of pneumonia at the age of 91 on the 24th of August, 1913, and he was buried in the same suit he was wearing when he and Mary wed in 1838, 75 years earlier. I'm assuming he didn't wear that suit that entire time, but was buried in the same suit he was married in. But it gets, I don't know if this gets better or gets worse, depends on how you look at it. Mary died of a cerebral hemorrhage just 6 days after her husband. So the Wrights died, arm in arm at the same time, but George and Mary Francis died within a few days of each other. Another sweet story, Joseph and Kate Griffith. They are buried just over that way, so once again a little bit far off of the path. Joseph died at his wife's grave in 1871, a little more than a year after his wife, Kate, in 1870. And he died from heart disease. Now, if you're familiar with the Simpsons episode where Grandpa Simpson falls in love with Beatrice Simmons, I think she died of the same thing. She died of heart disease, or I should say Beatrice Simmons died of heart disease. But in this case, Joseph Griffith died of heart disease. Or as you might say, as they said in The Simpsons, he died of a broken heart. And then one other, the story of Dr. Harvey and Amelia Harkness. They're actually not too far. They're about that direction right over there, but still a little bit off the path. Now, Dr. Harkness, he was born to a poor farming family in Massachusetts in 1821. He was one of 7 children, and all but one brother died of tuberculosis while Harvey was a youth. So he knew tragedy from the very beginning. He came to California for health reasons during the gold rush. He was described as very tall, unusually handsome, well-dressed, and a studious intellectual. Started a successful medical practice in 1850, and he was a physician and friend. He had some big names here: Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, who's just buried just over that way a little bit. You can't miss his mausoleum, but Mark Hopkins, and other notables. very successful life, starting out very poor, but very successful life. He was a trustee for the newly founded Stanford University. He was a member of Sacramento's first Board of Health. He was president of the first Sacramento Board of Education back in 1853, and his astute real estate investments allowed him to retire at the age of 48. With the money, he moved to San Francisco to study, and this is of course what everybody wants to do, to study Pacific Coast fungi, and he published a catalog, a very thorough catalog of Pacific Coast fungi. And also he was president of the California Academy of Science from 1887 to 1896. So very successful. Started off very poor, just became very successful. That was Dr. Harvey Harkness.
Where did he go to university?
That I don't know. I'd have to look that up for you. But as I said, very successful. I bring him up in this tour because he married Amelia Griswold in 1854, but she died within a year. Now, despite his looks, his wealth, his intelligence, and success, he never remarried, and in fact died single nearly 46 years later, and was reunited here with his deceased wife decades after she had died, shortly after their 1-year anniversary. Now, Julianna, another sort of a lighter story, but one more sweet story.
All right, so if you take a look behind me, you'll see the large statue. That's the Crocker family, E.B. Crocker and Margaret. The E.B. Crocker was the lawyer for the railroad, for the Central Pacific Railroad. Therefore, he had a lot of money. He left today's equivalent of $200 million to his youngest daughter, Amy, when he passed away. So Amy was very adventurous. She liked adventure a lot. She traveled. She used that money quite well. And when Eric told me he wanted me to talk about Amy Crocker, I said, okay, what's the angle? What do you want me to say? Because there's a lot about Amy Crocker. And he said, maybe talk about how she really seemed to believe in love. I was like, okay. Well, I'll be honest. I don't know if she believed in love or she just really liked adventure. Because she had numerous love affairs with the likes of actors and a Spanish bullfighter, a German prince, a member of the Japanese nobility, Aleister Crowley, if you've ever heard of him. Aleister Crowley. So she had a lot of different love affairs. Now she was married, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, but 5 times. Husband number 1 was rumored to have won her in a poker game. Husband number 2, after she divorced husband number 1, was the loser in that poker game, allegedly. Husband number 3 was the brother of her daughter's husband. So she and her daughter married brothers. Of course, to be fair, Amy married her husband first. Her 4th husband was, I guess, a fake Russian prince. She thought he was a real Russian prince, but then found out later he wasn't. Husband number 5 was a real prince. So she was born Amy Isabella Crocker, A-M-Y. She changed her name to Amy, A-I-M-E-E. So she died Princess Amy Isabella Crocker Ash Gillig Gerard Miskinov Galitzine. And she fascinated the king of Hawaii so much that he gave her her own island with 300 of her own natives. So she was a very fascinating woman. Men must have just not been able to handle themselves around her, I guess. I don't know. But one of her friends, when she was going to marry her last husband, who by the way was 26, she was 61. Oh, and when they divorced, she made sure that she got to keep the title princess. So when she married this husband, or was about to marry him, one of her friends was a bit confused as to how many marriages she's had. And she asked, is this number 5 or number 6? To which Amy replied, this is a quote, "The prince is my 12th husband if I include in my matrimonial list 7 Oriental husbands not registered under the laws of the Occident." So, if ever there should be a movie written about someone's life, I think it's Amy Crocker. Now, if you're interested in her story, you can buy a book that she wrote about her life called And I'd Do It Again.
Yeah.
21st of August, 1902. Now, she was described as the most estimable and refined young woman. Miss Ellis Curtis, daughter of ex-supervisor William Curtis, borrowed a gun from a relative just a few days after her 26th birthday, went to her room and shot herself in the chest. Now, although she did not die for 2 days and remained conscious for most of that time, she said nothing about why, except that she had indeed done the act and desired to die. Well, 3 theories were put forward about why she did it. Number 1, that she was overtaxed by helping with her father's business affairs. this was denied by the family. It was fine. She wasn't overtaxed by helping a father run his business. The other two theories put forward concern a young man Alice had formed a strong attachment to. So the second theory was the young man opposed Mr. Curtis, her father, in a political campaign, but friends of the family denied that as well. All Mr. Curtis wanted was a husband for his daughter that could support her through married life. So theory number two, not a whole lot of water right there. The third, perhaps closer to the truth, that the young man could not support a wife and met with Mr. Curtis's disapproval. So I'm leaning towards number three, perhaps stuck between love for her father and love for this young man. And I've never been able to find out the name of this young man, but perhaps stuck between love for her father and the young man. Alice, I should say, just decided to, no decision, I suppose, is decision, and decided to commit suicide rather than make a decision between her father and her brother. Please follow me. But this is my favorite spot in the cemetery. I just like the view. I like how the rise in the hill.
Oh yeah, it's pretty. Oh.
Yes. Old City Cemetery has one of the, if not the highest spot in Sacramento, but at least one of the highest spots. And so during the often flooding we would have, people would come here, oddly enough, to the cemetery to seek refuge from the flood. To avoid drowning, they come here to a cemetery. But it made sense. It's one of the highest spots in Sacramento.
Yeah.
Just right in here, I've got a nice stretch of plenty of shade. Now, I was able to find one article on the following man, and try as I might, the article said it best, so I'm just going to read to you verbatim what the Sacramento Union had to say about this man back on the 26th of July of 1897. Headline was, "Forgot himself. A would-be suicide falls into a peaceful slumber. There came near being a tragedy in the city cemetery yesterday, and doubtless would have been had not the person chiefly concerned imbibed more liquor than he could manage. A couple of ladies who were in the cemetery awaiting the arrival of a funeral cortege saw a man lying across a grave with a pistol in his right hand. They supposed him to be dead. They informed the undertaker and coroner clerk and Reverend Mr. Meal of their discovery, and the gentlemen went to investigate the matter. They found that the man was a former Sacramentan who came to the city on a Saturday for a short stay. He was lying across his wife's grave and was in a stupefied condition from drink. They got him up, placed him in a carriage, and sent him to the home of a friend. The man had, in his irresponsible condition, no doubt intended to take his life while lying on his wife's grave, but went to sleep instead. Later in the day, he was all right and intended departing the morning." Now, I've been unable, as I said, to learn the identity of this man and his wife, but fortunately for me, the records show only one funeral was being held that day, and since those women were there for a funeral, that was for Celeste Kurtz, unmarked grave, but just basically those bushes right there. That's where it was. So somewhere around this area, that incident happened. So just, I suppose, a little bit luckier than the next story we'll hear. So if you could please follow me, still in the shade. We're waiting. That Eric is known as Cemetery Eric. I'm known as Capital Eric.
It's just a Julianna.
Well, that's true, but I take what Julianna says as written in gold. So.
My husband doesn't, so you shouldn't.
Yeah.
All right, the next grave, you can almost see it from here if you just turn around and look down that way, very near the brick wall as it extends towards Masonic Cemetery, very near the end. In fact, I think you can actually see it from one of the shorter. It's a military, white marble stone, and that is for the body of Mr. Benjamin Martz. Now, the body of Benjamin Martz, 63 years of age, was found lying on his back across his wife's grave. There was a wound found behind his right ear and a pistol in his right hand. Now, the suicide caught friends by surprise. He was a former police officer, and he'd recently discussed with them running for a chief of police. However, others had noticed despondency and frequent references to his wife, Ellen, who had died 2 months prior. Martz commented to a friend that he had property enough to cover his debt and have a surplus of a few $100s. Now, this is despite having lost his job as he was working for a police officer, but working the railroad shops here in Sacramento. But despite that, still had money to pay off debts after his death. Now, suicide note was found on his body, and it read this. Read thusly: "Oh, this is a cold world. Oh, beloved Ellen, I cannot live in this cold world without you. Farewell to all my friends. I have done some service for my country, but what of that? I hold malice to no one. I hope the brother Oddfellows will take charge of my body. Financial troubles the cause of this rash act. Signed, P.W. Martz." Now, this story could have ended well, considering what had happened, but it could have ended well. There was money to pay off debts with surplus even after his death. His brother Oddfellows could take charge of the body, take charge of the funeral, and he could be buried next to his beloved Ellen. Except it didn't quite work out in that last case, because that suicide, Ellen's grave is not located here in Old City Cemetery. It's in fact located at St. Joseph's Cemetery down the road, just off of Broadway on 21st Street. St. Joseph is a Catholic cemetery. Because of that, Benjamin Martz committing suicide, he was not allowed to be buried next to his beloved Ellen, so he was brought here and buried here. So depending on who you talk to, they may be reunited in the afterlife, but their mortal remains at least remain separated for the rest of eternity.
Sounds like we should talk to the new pope about straightening that up.
Yeah, we could do that, yes.
Yeah, no doubt.
Next story. It's
Okay.
This is a wonderful story. You may have heard this before if you were at Eric's, or other Eric's, whatever you want to call him, that guy over there, at his haberdasher tour, but I felt it was so well researched, so well told, and it really went with the theme of my tour, so I asked Mattie back to tell the story, and actually another story a little bit later. So
Thank you, Eric.
take it away, Mattie.
Okay, I brought my cheat sheet. Hope I don't have to use it. Elizabeth Methvin was buried somewhere over there when she died in the 1930s. In the 1950s, her family moved her to East Lawn, but we consider her a long-term resident. She was here for 20 years, so we can tell a story about her, okay? Elizabeth was a dressmaker. She lived with her daughter, Maud, who worked at Weinstock's. And they lived a very boring, ordinary life until January of 1896, when they discovered that Maud had a stalker. That day in January 1896, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth opened the door and found a strange young man standing there, and he said, "I want to speak to Maud." And Maud looked over her mother's shoulder, and she didn't know this guy, so she said, "If you have something to say to me, you can say it in front of my mother." And the young man tried to come in the house, so Elizabeth pushed the door shut, but he got his arm inside, and he had a gun in his hand. He fired off one shot. Fortunately, it went into the wall. Then he pulled his arm out. The neighbors heard the gunshot, and they all came running, and they distracted him. He put the gun to his head, but as he looked around at the neighbors, Elizabeth managed to get the gun out of his hand. And then the guy did something strange. He just kind of slowly sauntered away. He didn't run away. He just kind of wandered. So the police had no trouble picking him up. They took him to jail. He told them his name was Anton Berry. He was 21. He worked as a tailor, and they could tell he was extremely intoxicated. During the investigation, they talked to his family, and his family told the police that Anton had an alcohol problem, and it was so bad that they had sent him to an establishment called Dr. Corey's Gold Cure to sober him up, but it didn't work. His friends told a different story. They said Anton was the funniest guy you've ever seen when he drinks. Oh, there's this one time he put his spurs on and he climbed over a sack of potatoes because he thought it was his horse. Oh. And then there was this other time he found this great big butcher knife, and so he walked down the street trying to attack an invisible enemy in front of him. That was hilarious. And oh, the best one of all, the best story about Anton, he went into Weinstock's one day and he saw this girl named Maud who worked there, and he fell instantly in love with her, but he was too shy to talk to her. So some of his buddies started writing love letters and signing Maud Methvin's name to them. And it drove him crazy, and oh, it was hilarious. Oh, no, that wasn't so funny because he went to her house and tried to kill her. He was charged with attempted murder, but the charges were reduced to assault because everyone could tell there was something seriously wrong with this young man. He was sentenced to 3 months in jail, and the Methodists were satisfied. They thought, that's okay, he has troubles, he'll sober up, he'll be okay. They were wrong. 10 months later, he was back in the news and back in jail for threatening the life of Maud Methvin again. And we don't know precisely what he did because the newspapers didn't go into detail, but at this point, Maud was seriously afraid of this guy. The judge realized that jail wasn't the right place for him. So he was sent to the insane asylum in Stockton, where he sobered up, dried out, cleaned up. He was released and declared cured. A few months later, he showed up in Sacramento again, this time with guns blazing. He went straight to Dr. Corey's gold cure. He fired 3 shots into the sidewalk outside the front door. Dr. Corey came running outside to see what was going on. And Anton Berry said, Dr. Corey, I'm drunk. I need a dose of the cure, and I am going to kill Maud Methvin. Dr. Corey got him inside, where he fired another shot into the floorboards for good measure. He was given a dose of the cure, which may have been laudanum or some other drug. And Dr. Corey went and got the police, and by the time they got back, Anton was passed out on the floor. And they hauled him off to jail. And for some reason, this time he was only charged with simple drunkenness. He was only given 24 hours in jail and let go again. 2 months later, Elizabeth Methvin was walking down the street, and who should she see but Anton Berry? She immediately ran off, found a police officer, who immediately arrested Anton and took him to jail. But there was a problem this time. Anton was stone cold sober. He didn't have a weapon on him, and he had not committed any crime. So the police were obligated to release him. And as they were escorting him to the door to send him on his way, he turned around and said, by the way, do you know if there's a warrant for my arrest in Stockton? So the police said, Anton, come back inside for a minute. So they brought him back in the jail. They wired the Stockton Police Department, and the answer came back, oh yeah, we want this guy. He's wanted down in Stockton. Apparently after Anton got out of the insane asylum, he got a job in a shop, which was probably a tailor shop because that was his profession, and he embezzled from the shop. So the Stockton police came and took poor Anton Berry away. But Sacramento wasn't done with him yet. About a year later, he came back. This time he went to a photography studio. He may have been there to have his portrait done for his love, Maud Methvin. But at any rate, he attacked the elderly photographer and stole his hat. And when he was arrested, he said, I guess I did it. I don't know. I was drunk. He was offered a choice of $50 fine or 50 days in jail, and we don't know which he took. What we do know is he disappeared from Sacramento after that. He must have finally gotten over Maud Methvin. 6.5 years later, he turned up in Santa Ana, down in Orange County. He married a woman named Margaret, and 4 months later, he was dead. We don't know what happened to him. We can speculate about booze and guns, but we don't know. What we do know for sure is that Elizabeth and Maud Methvin were finally free of the terror of the terrible drunken tailor, Anton Berry.
Probably behind the bush for most of you, but I think the ability to stand in the shade is probably more important than seeing the gravestone, but it's right there. So let me come on back. You can take a look at it if you want, but I'm going to tell the story back here in the shade. Now, that tombstone just over there, that is for Richard Dick Van Olinda. Now, his wife, Margaret Van Olinda, is actually buried, and I'll show you where the grave is a little bit later. We'll go by it just down that way. So buried in separate spots, but also want to point out to you that they both died on October 5th, 1891. So you can probably guess this relationship did not end well. Now, it started off sweetly enough. Oh, excuse me, let me catch my breath here. Finding graves puts me out of breath. Do not want to end up here permanently. Well, maybe eventually, but not today. Now, the romance began sweetly enough. Young Dick had injured himself, and Margaret Duffy was called upon to nurse him back to health. They eventually fell in love and were married, but for whatever reason, the marital bliss didn't last very long. Dick began to drink. He would accuse Margaret of infidelity, she would protest her innocence, and he would cruelly beat her. And this eventually became well known among the neighbors. But Margaret, she put up with this behavior for a while, but then took their 2 children and moved back in with her family in West Sacramento. She asked Dick for a divorce. Now, one day, Margaret and her brother-in-law were in Sacramento when she saw Dick. She said to her brother-in-law, George, "There is Dick. He has a pistol, and I am afraid he is going to kill me." Now, George, the brother-in-law, walked with Margaret to protect her when Dick approached them. He asked for an interview with his wife. George followed, but then they got ahead of him, so got separated. We're not sure what was said, but chances are he probably asked her to forget about the divorce, to come back, bring the children back and live with them, to be a happily married family again. But whatever it was, like I said, it was probably that. But she refused. She wanted the divorce. She wanted to stay separated from Dick. So then on I Street, between 5th and 6th Street, Dick pulled out a pistol and declared, "Then nobody else shall have you because I am going to kill you." He fired twice at her and then twice at himself. Both died instantly. Now, usually, most of the stories I'm telling you featuring murder and suicide usually deal with guns. It's not always guns, however. The next story is about Adam and Christina Spone, who died once again on the same date, 23rd of June, 1854. So once again, didn't end very well. They were buried in the Tier grounds underneath Broadway. Now, Adam Spone, he was 30 years old at the time of his death, of Germany. He murdered his wife, Christina, 25, also of Germany, with a butcher knife. Now, police followed leads as near as Sutterville, just south of here, as far west as Benicia, and as far east as Jackson. That's over 100 miles between Benicia and Jackson, up in the gold country. But eventually, Adam's body was found drowned in the river at Sutter. Now, the Sacramento Union, you kind of wonder, why did he kill his wife? Don't know, not sure why. But the Sacramento Union described Christina, his wife, as eminently industrious and held in esteem by her friends. The only clue I can find about why the murder occurred, the only reference to a possible motive for the murder at the hands of her husband, was that she had fallen a victim, this is a quote, fallen a victim to unfounded suspicion. So whatever it was, apparently her husband suspected her of doing something she shouldn't have been doing and decided to kill her, to put an end to that. Then continuing on with the idea that, guns are a little too mainstream, the story of Agnes and Joseph Stribble, once again buried in the Tier grounds underneath Broadway. Now, Joseph Stribble entered his brother and sister-in-law's house early in the morning of June 21st, 1853, to kill his sleeping brother Henry with an axe. He apparently wished no harm upon Agnes, his sister-in-law, but when she awoke, he struck her with the axe. He attacked Henry in the same fashion, and thinking Henry was dead, Joseph finished his hellish work, another quote, hellish work, by slitting Agnes's throat. Joseph left and then cut his own throat. Should I put a disclaimer first before I told the story? Okay, sorry about that. Well, this is the worst of it, so once you get through it, you're okay. Just the heat you have to worry about. But Joseph left and then cut his own throat. He died 3 days later, but Henry survived the attack and recovered, dying in San Francisco in 1904. Now, as far as a motive for the murder, the Alta California reported the murderer paid attention to Agnes before her marriage, and the successful rivalship of his brother is the only motive that can be assigned.
As recently as March, and I thought I knew the whole story, but I was wrong. Eric, with the red umbrella over there, found a clue to another chapter of the story, and I did some more research, so now I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, the whole story. Right here is the grave of Jacob Klein. Jacob Klein and Josephine Wiesel grew up together. They were childhood sweethearts, and everybody figured they'd get married, and they did get engaged. But Josephine, who went by the nickname Feeny, realized that Jacob had a very bad temper, so she broke off the engagement, which made him furious. A few months after they broke off the engagement, this was in February of 1886, Josephine and Jacob ran into each other around 6th and J Street. They both lived in that neighborhood. And Jacob seemed to be in a good mood, and he said, "Feeny, let's go walking up J Street. I just want to talk to you for a while." And it was getting dark, but she said, okay. So they walked east on J Street to about 15th. Now today we know the Memorial Auditorium is on J Street between 15th and 16th, but in 1886, there was a large grammar school on that site. Jacob said, Feeny, let's cut through the grammar school lot and we'll walk back down I Street. And by this time it was dark, but Feeny said, okay. So they walked into the grammar school lot, and as they went behind the grammar school, something happened back there. Jacob claimed it was consensual. Feeny insisted it was not. They ended up not walking down I Street together. Jacob took off running on J Street. Somehow Feeny managed to get herself home. Even though her dress was torn, she was bloody, she was bruised, she was crying. Pretty obvious what happened to Feeny Weisel that night. Feeny had been a vivacious, popular young woman, about 21 years old, but after that night everything changed for her. She became absent-minded and forgetful. She had mood swings. She became anxious and nervous and worried. And she had good reason, because it wasn't long after that she realized she was carrying Jacob Klein's baby. She started going to the Klein house and begging Jacob to marry her, and he always refused. Finally, she got down on her knees and she said, Jacob, I don't want to live with you. I don't want your money. All I want is both of our names on a marriage certificate so I can be an honest woman and I can raise our child with a name. And Jacob's response? He said, you ask me to marry you one more time, I'm going to kick you so hard you'll lose that baby.
Wow.
Feeny was running out of options. She had one option left. She went to the hardware store. She bought herself a shiny little nickel-plated handgun. But then she realized if she pulled this thing out in public, the way it was so shiny, people would see it and they'd take it out of her hand before she had a chance to use it. So she went back to the hardware store and she traded it in on a little handgun that was made out of dark blue metal. Pretty smart. And she waited for her time to use it. And that time came in June. Jacob Klein played cornet in several local bands. And one of them had a standing engagement at the Plaza, which we now know as Cesar Chavez Plaza. And Feeny knew that he had a second engagement, and they sort of overlapped. And so he always left the Plaza before the last song was played. So she waited at the edge of the Plaza, and she watched the band play. And at the next to last song, Jacob packed up his cornet and he got down off the bandstand and he started walking towards her to leave the Plaza. And we don't know if he saw her, but she saw him. And as the band started playing its last song, Home Sweet Home, the paths crossed. And she pulled the little gun out of her handbag and she pointed it at the back of Jacob's head, fired one time, and Jacob Klein was dead before he hit the ground. Feeny just stood there and waited to be arrested. She was perfectly calm. The story that she gave the police and the reporters and anyone else who would talk to her was, Jacob Klein took my life, so I took his. And a life for a life is no robbery. The trial happened a couple months later and it was a sensation, mainly because every morning Feeny Weisel marched into the courtroom carrying her brand new baby boy with her. Now, in 1886-87, there was a theory that pregnant women were mentally unstable. Don't laugh. So the jury had to decide, was Feeny Weisel a cold-blooded murderer, or was she not guilty by reason of insanity? They decided not guilty by reason of insanity. So Feeny proved her point. A life for a life was no robbery. Now that's where I always ended the story. It didn't occur to me that there was another life profoundly impacted by this incident. It was the baby. His name was Charles. He had the last name Huber, so we assume Feeny married a man named Huber who adopted him. Later, Feeny took the last name Bauman. She must have remarried. Feeny decided to stay in Sacramento. If she had moved away to a town where nobody knew her story, or if she had changed her name, things might have gone different for Feeny and her son. But she decided to stay here. And her little boy, whose nickname was Tug, paid the price for it. His little playmates knew something was odd about Tug Huber because their parents would point to him and whisper. As he got older, his classmates learned the story of Tug Huber's origins, and they would talk about him behind his back, or they would outright tease him. And then as he got even older and he tried to find a job, everybody knew the story of Tug Huber. He had a hard time finding a job. Tug Huber was doomed from the get-go. He knew exactly what he was. He was the bastard child of a rapist and a murderer. he could not catch a break. So it's no wonder that he spiraled into a life of crime. Started out with petty crimes when he was a teenager, gradually built up, things got a little more serious, but then something good finally happened to Tug Huber. He met an 18-year-old girl named Myrtle, and she fell in love with him. She didn't care about his background. They got married, and they had a little girl named Margaret, and everything seemed to be going good for Tug Huber. But he just could not keep himself out of trouble. And when he was arrested for grand larceny and sentenced to 3 years in Folsom Prison, Myrtle had enough. She left him, she took Margaret, she divorced him, she married a man named Paul Palermo. They lived in Oak Park. When Tug was released from prison, he went to live with his mom, Feeney, who also lived in Oak Park. Naturally, Myrtle and Tug would run into each other now and then. And Tug started stalking Myrtle. He was determined to get her back. She was the only good thing he ever had in his life, and he was not going to let her go. Paul Palermo warned him, "Stay away from my wife. She wants nothing to do with you." By this time, Paul and Myrtle had their own baby, Evelyn. But Tug was determined he was going to get Myrtle back one way or another. He followed her. He stalked her. He learned her routines. He figured out where she went and what she did every day. One day, Myrtle was pushing baby carriage through the state fairgrounds at Oak Park. It wasn't fair season. The fairgrounds were empty, but people were using it to walk through. It was like a park. She was pushing the baby carriage, and Tug saw her there. And he approached her, started talking to her. He had a big wool blanket over his hand. They talked, they argued. She smacked him. She didn't know he had a gun under that blanket. He shot her in the face. Nobody heard the gunshot because the blanket acted like a silencer. He dropped the gun and the blanket on the ground. He didn't run away. He kind of zigzagged back and forth through a couple streets, and then he started ducking into backyards and front yards and alleys. He's trying to avoid attention, but just the opposite happened. An off-duty cop who happened to be visiting a friend in Oak Park saw this guy kind of ducking in and out of backyards and decided there was something suspicious about him. So he ran home, got his brother, who was also an officer, and the two of them followed this guy as he roamed his way through Oak Park. The man went into a house that was occupied by a Japanese family. He obviously didn't belong there. So the two officers went to the door and demanded that he come out. It took him a little while. When he came out, he was eating something and he swallowed it. And he said to them, "Is Myrtle dead?" And they didn't know what he was talking about because nobody had heard a gunshot. But one of them said, "Yes, she is." And he screamed, "I killed her because I loved her and I took poison." While that was happening, a man saw the body of Myrtle Palermo on the ground next to the baby carriage where Evelyn was screaming her brains out. And they put two and two together and realized that Tug had murdered his ex-wife, Myrtle. He was taken to the hospital because he had swallowed mercury salts, which is a very toxic poison, but unfortunately for Tug, it's also slow acting. It took him 10 days to die. The night before he died, his mom, Feeney, and a cop were in the room with him, and he begged them to be taken home. And they promised him, "Tomorrow you'll go home." And he did, in a coffin. Tug was buried somewhere down there near the southern end of the cemetery. Oddly enough, Myrtle is buried only a few plots away from him. Jacob is right here. I still haven't figured out what happened to Feeney. There might be more to the story, but I don't know where she was buried, and I don't know what happened to their daughter Margaret. So there could be another chapter yet to learn about this family. But right now we have 2 generations of tragedies with Jacob Klein, Feeney Vizel, Tug Huber, and Myrtle Palermo.
All right, now I will talk about Zebulon Gardner in the story just after I tell this first story. That is of Mary Lee, and she's buried in the Tear Grounds once again. We're not sure where that is under Broadway, but you'll see at the end of this story why I'm talking about her right here. But poor Mary Lee, poor meek Mary Lee, she was a 22-year-old prostitute from New Orleans. She made the mistake of sleeping with a man who, according to courtesan custom, belonged exclusively to another prostitute, Ida Van Aert, also known as Ida Brewer. I've seen both names listed. Ida soon found out about this little indiscretion, entered the house where Mary lived, and demanded that Mary be pointed out to her, which they did, pointed poor Mary out to Ida. Then, according to the newspaper, they didn't get specific, but said vile and obscene language followed from Ida, and she bantered Mary into the street, which is a second street between K and L streets. Now Mary, poor meek Mary, she confessed her guilt and promised to Ida that she would never do it again. Ida apparently was not satisfied with this. She slapped Mary Lee, and a struggle ensued. Ida drew a Bowie knife and stabbed Mary twice. The combatants were then separated and Mary put to bed. Now, she lived only 20 minutes longer, but she thought about her family. She asked her madam to write to her mother, and she was attended to, Dr. Harkis. We talked about Dr. Harkis a little bit earlier. Now, Ida was arrested, as well as her friend, another prostitute, Augusta Dennison, who had accompanied her, and she was charged with being an accomplice to the murder. Now, I talked to you about Mary Lee right here because Ida, in court, was defended by William Ferguson, future state senator, and his grave, right over there in our state section. You can see the big Irwin right there, Governor Irwin, a few stones right over. You can see his bas-relief, what is it from the side? No, not silhouette. Profile, thank you. Another reason to thank you. But just a little Ferguson. So future state, wasn't a state senator at the time, but future state senator. And Augusta Dennison was defended by J. Neely Johnson, who was not buried here, but he went on to become governor of the state of California. So it's kind of interesting the kind of company that our politicians keep. Not today, but back in the past, the kind of business, the kind of company they would keep.
They're housekeepers.
He works for state parks at the Capitol. He has to make disclaimers.
Yes. I was wondering how far you were going to go with that. It's like, thank you for adding that second part. But at any rate, both were found innocent of the crime. My favorite newspaper quote I'll read to you today: "The courthouse rang with applause." So why that was, I don't know, but the courthouse rang with applause. Ida continued, however. She didn't learn her lesson. She continued her violent ways. She was arrested a couple of times more for attempted murder, assault and battery. She was arrested for. Eventually, she was listed in 1862 as one of only 3 female prisoners at San Quentin. So she must have been pretty bad to end up among only 2 other women at the state prison at San Quentin. But then eventually, Ida disappears from the record.
What's her last name?
It's Mary Lee's, the prostitute who's buried here. Ida Vanard, I believe, it's hard to tell, but I think Brewer is her married name. So you'll see sometimes Ida Vanard and sometimes Ida
They
Brewer.
found her innocent even though she stabbed a girl.
Yes, with witnesses. Yes.
Trip, huh?
Yes.
Even political. Wow.
Maybe that explains why the courthouse erupted with applause after they were found innocent. I don't know.
It was filled with men.
It would quite possibly, yes. All right, now, getting back to Zebulon Gardner and his wife, Mary Gardner. Little story about Zebulon. He left Rhode Island in 1849 with only 50 cents in his pocket. He came to California via the Panama Canal and arrived in San Francisco in July of 1850. He started in mining, but he had a mind for business, so he went into business. Was successful. He bought a Sacramento lumber yard and a flour mill in Knight's Landing. Now, August 25th, 1861, he was going to sail on the steamer J.A. McClellan to take the payroll to his mill workers down in Knight's Landing. Now, Captain Mills of the J.A. McClellan blew the first whistle of 3 of warning to passengers to hurry up and get on board. Now, Zebulon's wife, Mary, had taken ill. Now, he considered, because of this, to care for his sick wife, he considered not going. But then the second whistle blew, another warning. Wife, Mary, begged Zebulon not to go. Zebulon paced the room. He knew it was important to get the payroll down to his workers. They're waiting for it, trying to make a decision. His wife continued to plead with him not to go, but then the third whistle blew. Zebulon made up his mind. He kissed Mary tenderly and ran for the steamer. Now, the J. McClellan had just left the landing. It was the third whistle of 3, so it just left the landing. Zebulon rushed for her, jumped, and made it. The deckhand saw his run for the boat and grabbed him and pulled him over the rail to safety. Now, deckhand saved his life, only to seal his fate. At 1:30 p.m., 6 miles downriver of Knight's Landing, the boiler of the J.A. McClellan exploded. 15 were killed immediately, several more fatally wounded. All but one of the 30 aboard of a crew and passenger were injured. Now, pieces of the boiler were found 300 yards away. Body of a crewman, literally broken in 2, was found 200 yards away. The whole thing was just kindling. So bad that Gardner's body was not found for 10 days. So the lesson learned from this is to listen to your wife. You know. Yes, exactly. Now, just down the way, just a little bit, a similar story. Left his wife and child in Sacramento to secure employment at Strawberry Valley. 2 weeks later, he cut his leg severely, but refused to have his family informed, as it would cause them, as he thought, useless distress, and as he expected to be able to return home in a short time. But it was not to be. 4 weeks later, he died of his injury. The first notice his wife, Elizabeth, received of her husband's injury and death was via a telegram from Henry's employer informing her that Henry's body would be arriving by train in just a few hours. So as I said, listen to your wife. Also make sure to communicate with her as well. And then also another little bit of sweet, little bit of tragic. Our next story will be told by Julianna of Maria Rupp, right over there.
You can stay where you are. I'll just come over here. So this is the grave of Maria Rupp. She was a saloon proprietress of the Sacramento Beer Saloon down on 2nd and K. And she'd been here for about 5 years. She was from Germany. And she had a bit of an admirer. His name was Peter Metz. And he kept asking her to marry him. And she kept laughing it off. Now, in my opinion, if you're working at a saloon, you're probably getting a lot of those marriage proposals, and probably most of them aren't being remembered. So I don't blame her so much for laughing them off. But he didn't forget about it. He would go around and he would tell people, if I can't have her, nobody can. And then he would tell people, I'm going to marry her, and I'm going to take her business. So one evening, in the fall of 1857, she had come home from church. She was a Catholic in good standing. And she's kind of an interesting character in that she owned the saloon, which had rooms above it. So there's some question about that. But the paper did write her up as a Catholic in good standing. So I'll let you go ahead and think what you want there. So anyway, she came home. It's about 11:30 at night. In comes Mr. Peter Metz. And he came over to the piano where she's playing the piano for about a dozen customers. He leaned over her. The bartender thought he was going to give her a kiss, which of course would be not okay in 1857, but instead, he pulled out a knife and he stabbed her in the left breast. She died very shortly after. Now that's not the end of the story. Part of the reason she couldn't marry Peter Metz was that she already had a fiance. He was a doctor in San Francisco. Shortly after, he passed away from natural causes or a disease, something like that. And we think he gave his body to science. But he left one request, that his heart be buried right here with Maria Rupp. Now he was from San Francisco, so we say that's one man who did not leave his heart in San Francisco. It's her and the heart.
Come on in the shade if you like. All right, one last story for today, and that is the story of John A. Benson, who was buried right there. Now, John A. Benson should have known better. He should have stayed away from the home of his employee, Green Palmer. He should have stayed away from Palmer's children, and most certainly away from Mrs. Palmer. Benson shouldn't have gone riding repeatedly with her. Benson shouldn't have visited Sacramento with her, even if it was just to sign a deed. Benson shouldn't have, as Palmer put it, tampered with Mrs. Palmer by having, or so Palmer claimed, a 5-year affair with her. And Benson certainly shouldn't have offered Mrs. Palmer and later Mr. Palmer directly $1,000 to take Mrs. Palmer as his mistress. But that's exactly what Benson did. Despite all of this, one afternoon in mid-February 1859, Palmer, taking a break from plowing Benson's field, went to a restaurant where he was joined by Benson and a Dr. Hogaboo, and all three drank together. Palmer's 4 children entered the establishment, and Benson, as was his custom, gave them nuts and candies. After that, 3 men went to Palmer's home. This is despite the fact that earlier, Palmer had warned Benson to stay away from his house, and Benson threatened to show up anyway and to blow Palmer's head off if he interfered with him. Now, unbelievably, it was reported that Benson and Palmer appeared to be on good terms with each other and had friendly conversation at Palmer's house. But perhaps this was simply part of Palmer's plan. One of Palmer's children had undergone an operation on her foot, and Dr. Hogaboom examined the work. After that, the doctor and Benson left Palmer's house, and all seemed well. That is until Benson heard Palmer calling out to him, and upon turning around, saw Palmer running at him with a revolver in his hand. Benson, figuring out what was going on, cried out, "Don't, Green!" But Palmer replied, "You damned son of a bitch, you have disgraced my children." Palmer fired 2 or 3 times, fatally wounding Benson, who would die a half hour later. Upon shooting Benson, Palmer returned to his house to reload. His wife asked him what he had done, and he replied that she knew very well, and also what he did it for. With that, he made his escape into the country. At first, he was not pursued, perhaps an indication that his neighbors felt he was justified in his actions, so the dead man's brother offered a $300 reward for the fugitive's capture. But it was just 1 day later, on February 15th, that Palmer, shivering with cold, suffering from hunger, and willing to turn himself in, was found. It took only 3 trials to finally find him not guilty. However, Palmer was not long for this world. A little more than 3 weeks after being acquitted in January of 1860, Palmer took his own life by ingesting strychnine. Palmer's friend, a J.H. Veach, running into the Palmer house after hearing Mrs. Palmer's cry, exclaimed, "Why have you done this?" This woman, Palmer answered, as Adam did before God in the Garden of Eden, "is the cause of all my trouble. I wish to die and get out of my misery." And so ended Green Palmer. And if Palmer was found on February 15th, the day after the murder, then what does that make the day of the murder? Exactly, February 14th, Valentine's Day. With that, that is the end of our tour. So thank you very much. Be sure to thank Mattie, and where did Julianna go? Where did she go? She is, oh, there she is.